I just want to point something out about the bootstraps argument. The pull yourself up by your own bootstraps argument that they're throwing around here. Um, as I've mentioned a few times, the host of this show is a little bit to the right of the Canadian spectrum, which is not. He's not Bill O'Reilly. He's, you know, he's not even Chris Matthews. He's probably more like Cenk Uygur, but that's to the right of the Canadian spectrum, right? So. Um, and they're talking about I mean, everybody on there's like six people here, and everybody on the panel is ganging up on him, which is what usually happens on this show, which is why it's tolerable, right? Um, so you got this guy, and he's the only conservative in the room, right? Consistently, um, so you walk away from it thinking, like the host of this show is a jerk. But I mean, part of the reason why is because he's consistently arguing with people to his left, right? And often getting badly ganged up on, which is what's happening here. But I just want to what I want to point out is that I think he may have been creating one of the panelists here. I think it was that guy, or it might have been one of the other guys. He may have been creating a bit of a straw man around the idea of the whole bootstrap pulling thing, right? But the reaction that the host provided was, see, the guest pointed out that a lot of people have the misunderstanding that the pull yourself up by your own bootstrap approach, the sort of hands-off government approach, is more fiscally responsible. When in fact, see, and again, this is why Canadian liberals are so successful, is because they get the math and they know that the studies actually indicate that that approach is more expensive than putting money down up front, right? And it's partly because of the way the system is designed, right? Um, like we have universal health care here, for example. We have government-run food banks, all these sorts of things, right? So when you take that into account, it costs less money, to put into the social systems, to put into addictions treatment, housing services. It will cost taxpayers less in the long run if they just take the homeless guy off the street. They put him up somewhere. They put him through addictions counseling. That is cheaper than letting him out in the street and then having to pay for hepatitis. It's got frostbite because he's out in the cold. Um, ends up breaking and entering. He's got to go through court costs. All that kind of stuff. On a per person basis, that they do. Canadians do this math. It's a part of our public policies. Our governments figure this stuff out, and they base their policies on what the math says. And what the math says is that if you're really concerned about taxpayer money, it makes more sense to deal with it beforehand rather than deal with the consequences of it. Um, it's not that I think I think most Americans understand that, but you'll never get your government to follow through with it. Um, in Canada, the government is pushing it constantly, right? Um, we don't need to yell at our governments to do this because they know better and they just do it, right? Um, but the reaction that we got from the host on that was kind of a sour look, um, indicating that he was conceding. He knew that it was right, but he didn't like it, right? And I think that that's kind of maybe a misperception that a lot of liberals have. Um, when you're arguing with, I mean, conservatives might want to throw out numbers, right? And they might make it think that that's what it's about. And I think that maybe the plot has been lost somewhere over the last 40 years. I actually think that the reason why conservatives throw numbers at you is because they expect you to throw numbers at them. Liberals kind of don't do that as much as they used to. If you go back, 60, 70 years ago, it was the liberals that had all the data, had all the numbers. They were consistently, and I mean, depending on where you go, they still do, right? But Um, they had all the economic arguments on their side. They were constantly pushing economic models. They had the mainstream of science and everything on their side, right? And I mean they still do, but they were very forceful about it, right? Nowadays, it's the right that's doing that all the time, right? And they're citing sketchy sources, right? They want to throw they want to throw their mises at you, right? That's sketchy source, right? But they'll do it, right? And then they'll gather because they have all these think tanks, and maybe that's really probably the biggest thing that's changed is where the money goes, right? 60 years ago, you had the Rockefellers and you had the Fords, when they were sticking all kinds of money into all kinds of things, right? Nowadays, all the money is coming from the Cox and the and etc. And they're putting money into the into your heritage institutes and whatnot. So that's where the studies come from. That's where the data arises it from, right? And so you end up with conservatives throwing around all these numbers. A lot of times it's nonsense, but liberals have kind of adopted the position of like we're not gonna go down this route because we know that you're not gonna be honest, right? It's kind of a cut your losses strategy, right? Um, Liberals might realize that they're right, and that if we're going to have a serious discussion about numbers, then it'll come out. But most of the time, we're not going to have a serious discussion about numbers. We're going to be throwing around a lot of propaganda, and your conservative opponent is probably engaging in outlandish demagoguery. They're not just throwing around false data. They know they're throwing around false data. They're openly lying to you, but they're trying to convince you through, and then you've got an audience in front of you, and they don't really know which one's right and which one's wrong. So liberals have adopted a tactic, and I guess this is since 85 or so, of just like, we're not going to do this, right? We'll let you know we'll let the smart kids do their own research and figure it out on their own. We're not going to give you a platform to confuse the ignorant with, right? And so now when you have a liberal throw numbers out there like that, um, this is kind of the reaction you get. But like I say, I think it's more like, I think that the guy was expecting the host to react positively to the numbers and say, okay, well, if the numbers say this, then this is what we should do, right? And he seems to have it in his mind that winning an argument with the conservative is really just a question of showing them, showing them the money, showing them the data, right? Um, but that's not what he got, right? Like I say, and I just went over why that's maybe an inversion of the truth, but what he actually got was a kind of a, okay, you're right, but what about the moral issue? And that's really what you're fighting with conservatives, right? You can show them all the data in the world, all the numbers. You can come up with the best economic arguments you can come up with. There's still ultimately the feeling of a lack of contribution, right? The idea that it's not fair for society to compensate, you know. And even beyond the fairness, there's the idea that I don't want to, right? I worked hard to get where I got to, and I don't want to share. Even if in the long run, you know, I'll spend a little money if it. I'll spend, I'm okay with the public funds being siphoned out a little bit heavier if it means that we're not, engaging in this kind of socialism, right? And so there's the philosophical aspect to it. It just jumped out at me here. It just became obvious. The liberal guy had it. He nailed it. He had him nailed, right? Just absolutely like there's no debate. like you lose, right? But it didn't really convince him because that's not really what the issue was, right? It wasn't really about the money. It was about the perception of things and the idea of just not liking government as um, as a distributive agent, right? That's why well, maybe I should just leave it at that. But so something to keep in mind when you're arguing with conservatives, and I've spent so much time arguing with the right. I can pick I can pick shit like this out. Okay? Um, a lot of times, you might be surprised to see where things are really sitting with them. Um, in most cases, like I say, I do think the data. Um, well, I mean, if you really know how to read numbers, if you really know data, you know that they're always wrong, right? If you look at the historical record, they're always wrong. And that's what it is. It's a facade. They throw numbers around because they're trying to convince you, not because they believe them themselves. And so they come up with these arguments that half the time they don't even really understand because they think that that's the tool they need to convince liberals. And the liberals have got kind of lost the plot on it. You don't convince a conservative with data. You got to get to their hearts, right? Because that's how they think, really, right? It's the cold scientific liberals that need the scientific method, not the at heart religious fundamentalist conservatives, right?